All right, how's everybody doing? Hotep. Hey, this is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. I'm a talk show host, researcher, lecturer, and writer. I'm the founder here of the African History Network. Hope everybody's doing well. It is Monday, November 5th, 2018, and we are live. So it's the day before midterm elections. And some of you all saw my radio show last night. You saw the Facebook Live broadcast we did here, the African History Network show. And last night I dealt with the history of how and why African Americans switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. Okay, if you missed that, you can watch that right here. Follow us here on Facebook, the African History Network, the African History Network here on Facebook. And just click on videos, all right? And then also I put it on my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep on YouTube. So I dealt with that history last night. I also talked about Malcolm X and the Ballad of the Bullet, because a lot of people misquote Malcolm when he's talking about the Democrats and the Dixiecrats and being a traitor to your race if you keeps talking about belonging to a party that controls 2/3 of the government. I talked about that as well, so check that out. So today I want to deal with this history dealing with the Opelousas Massacre of 1868. The Opelousas Massacre of 1868, which took place in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. And this is during Reconstruction. So Reconstruction's 1865 to 1877, okay? And we know that is going to be, during this time, African Americans are making some types of gains, but we know that because of the compromise of 1877 and because of the Union troops, largely because of the Union troops being taken out of the South, the Union troops were enforcing to a certain degree the rights of African Americans and providing some type of cover for them, some type of protection. And this is going to change when you have the compromise of 1877 and the Union troops are removed out of the South, and an increase in terrorism among African Americans is going to take place. Okay, so when we look at this story, this took place in September of 1868. Okay, starts September 28th, 1868. And it's a good article from SmithsonianMag.com about this, which is the official website of the Smithsonian Institute. Southern white Democrats hunted down around 200 African Americans in an effort to suppress voter turnout. So if you think that African Americans did not die for the right to vote, that means you do not understand history. That is not true. This is just one of many massacres. We could talk about the Wilmington Massacre of 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina. We could talk about the Coihee Massacre in Florida, okay, that took place also. I forgot what year that was. This is a good article from Vice.com about that. That was in about 1920. Yeah, the 1920 massacre in Florida. So there's a history of this. So if you think that African Americans did not die for the right to vote, did not die trying to vote, that is false. It means you really need to study some history. So the Opelousas Massacre occurred in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. It's also called the Opelousas Riot. And the initial catalyst for the massacre was the attempt by some African Americans there in Opelousas to join a Democratic Party political group in the neighboring town of Washington. White Democrats in Opelousas were mainly white Democrats in Opelousas, mainly members of the Seymour Knights, which is a white supremacist group there. It's a local unit of a white supremacist organization, the Seymour Knights, S-E-Y-M-O-U-R. And you also had the Knights of the White Camellia. Okay, they were the local unit of a white supremacist organization called the Knights of the White Camellia. So it wasn't just the Ku Klux Klan that we were fighting against and fearing and being terrorized by. The Ku Klux Klan is the most well-known white supremacist terrorist organization back at this time, but you had other organizations as well, like the Knights of the White Camellia. You're also going to have the Black Legion. Also, that's another white supremacist organization that terrorized African Americans. So the Knights of the White Camellia were founded in 1867. So slavery ends, the chattel slavery ends 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. December 6, 1865 is ratified, is adopted December 18th, 1865. About 6 months before that, the Civil War officially ends, June 2nd, 1865. Okay. So, in response, so what's going to happen is the Knights of the White Camellia visited the town of Washington to violently drive these African Americans out of this Democratic Party political group. So in response to this, you have an 18-year-old white Republican who was the editor for a local newspaper. His name was Emerson Bentley. The newspaper was called the Landry Progress, okay? And it was a Republican newspaper. So at this time, you know, the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln. The Republican Party was created in 1854 by groups of abolitionists, okay, to be the counter at that time to the Democratic Party. And Frederick Douglass was a Republican, all right? What's going to happen over time, and watch the broadcast I did last night, I dealt with the history going back to 1928 and going back to the 1920s of how and why the shift takes place among African Americans, because our needs were not being, the issues pertaining to us were not being addressed by the Republican Party. In 1928, you had Herbert Hoover, who was running for president as the Republican candidate. He won the nomination, and he was implementing the Lily White movement. The Lily White movement was a movement to push African Americans out of the Republican Party and to ignore our issues, ignore civil rights, things like this. So as time goes on, as this grows, and then you go into the you have the Great Depression in 1929. You have President Roosevelt winning the election in 32, winning the election in 32, becoming president 33. As time goes on, the Democratic Party became more receptive to African Americans in addressing our issues, and you have the Great Migration taking place, and African Americans are moving from the South up north into these northern cities: Detroit, Gary, Indiana, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Chicago, Illinois, things like this. And they're looking for their issues, their needs to be met, and they can vote also, okay? And they're not getting the proper response from the Republican Party, so they move over to the Democratic Party, and that takes years for that to happen. So by 1960, when John F. Kennedy is running against Richard Nixon, 1960, 2/3 of African Americans had switched over to the Democratic Party by then. It wasn't because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, okay? You have 1/3 of us that are still in the Republican Party by 64, and most of them are going to switch over to the Democratic Party, and it had to do with getting our issues addressed. Barry Goldwater, who was the Republican nominee, senator from Arizona, in 64, he was anti-civil rights, okay? And we saw him in opposition to policies that benefited us, so we voted for President Johnson, okay? And you're going to have the Civil Rights Act of 64 that's going to be signed into law July of 1964, okay? The month after Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were killed, June 21st, 1964 in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Okay, so all this had the shift. It all had to do with our issues being addressed and who we could get the most out of. Okay, but I went in depth into that history last night, so go watch that broadcast. All right, share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in. Also, how's everybody doing? Okay. Okay, so in response to the attack by the Seymour Knights, this white supremacist organization, Emerson Bentley, the white editor of the local newspaper there, and he was also an influential school teacher who promoted the education of African American children. He wrote in the newspaper, he wrote an article for the newspaper which described the violence that the Seymour Knights had used against African American Democrats in Washington, and argued that such violence should persuade the blacks to remain loyal to the Republican Party. Okay, he's talking about Washington, the town of Washington in Louisiana, not Washington D.C. All right. Now Emerson Bentley had also been promoting the education of African American children and spent time registering African Americans to vote. Now, shortly after the article appeared in the newspaper, Emerson Bentley was assaulted and severely beaten by 3 white men while he taught his class. After the assault, Emerson Bentley fled town and headed back up north. Okay, and at this time, you're going to have the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau was called the the U.S. Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands. And one of the things that the Freedmen's Bureau did was to help provide some type of medical care for the formerly enslaved Africans, to build schools, provide education. They were also taking out ads in newspapers to help African Americans find lost loved ones who had been separated during slavery. Okay, this is another thing that the Freedmen's Bureau was doing as well. Okay, so if we look at the article from SmithsonianMag.com, the deadliest massacre in Reconstruction Era Louisiana happened 150 years ago. Okay, and that was some background information. I've talked about this before, so I have notes prepared on the Opelousas Massacre of 1868. That's just some background information as an introduction. All right. Also, hey, African American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. I'll let you know how you can advertise on the audio podcast of from the African History Network. We reach thousands of people across the country with each broadcast. We're on 6 different podcast platforms, including iTunes and Castbox, TuneIn.com. First month is 50% off. Email us at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. Customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. Also, if you like the type of information we share, you can donate to the African History Network at paypal.me/the AHN show. paypal.me/the AHN show. Okay. All right. So let me get into this article here. All right, so there was a note that was put on the schoolhouse door where Emerson Bentley taught. There was a note that said, they had the initials EB, and it said beware, KKK. EB, beware, KKK. Okay, and this note was for Emerson Bentley, okay, the white school teacher I was telling you about. And he found this message early in September of 1868. And the message illustrated with a coffin, a skull and bones, and a dagger dripping with blood. Okay? He found the message illustrated with a coffin, skull and bones, and a dagger dripping with blood. So the straightforward message represented a menacing threat to Emerson Bentley, who was teaching African American children in Louisiana at the time. So little Little could the Ohio-born Republican have predicted just how soon that violence would come about. Now, something to keep in mind about the Ku Klux Klan, right? We talk about the Ku Klux Klan terrorizing African Americans. They were terrorizing and killing some white people also, because they were going after white Republicans, okay? Because the Ku Klux Klan were largely Democrats at the time. They were largely Democrats. And they saw Republicans as the enemy, because the Republican Party during the Civil War, this is only a few years after the Civil War ends, the Republican Party was seen as the party of the North, the party of the Union. And the Democratic Party was seen largely as the party of the South, the party of the Confederacy. Okay? All right, so the straightforward message represented a menacing threat to Emerson Bentley. All right? Now, Bentley was 18 years old. He also worked at as one of the editors of the Republican paper, the St. Landry Progress. And this was one of the few, he was one of the few white Republicans in the Louisiana parish of St. Landry. He and others came to the region to assist recently emancipated African Americans find jobs, access education, and become politically active. With Louisiana passing a new state constitution in April of 1868, that included the new constitution included male enfranchisement, meaning men had the right to vote, male enfranchisement and access to state schools regardless of color. Emerson Bentley had reason to feel optimistic about the state's future. But Southern white Democrats were nowhere near willing to concede to power, concede the power that they held for decades before the Civil War. And in St. Landry, one of the largest and most populous parishes in the state, thousands of white men were eager to take up arms to defend their political power. So when you go study the massacres and the race riots that took place after the Civil War ended, they usually happen for a few reasons. One, it was over political power. African Americans trying to exercise their right to vote, trying to join a political party, in this case trying to join the Democratic Party. We see the same thing happen in 1898 in Wilmington, Delaware, the Wilmington Massacre there in 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina. Or you're going to see a massacre take place because a white woman lied about an African American man. He tried to rape her, he smiled at her, he winked at her, something like this. A lot of the lynchings that took place of African American men that involved white women, a lot of the interaction, a lot of the sexual interaction was consensual sex. But what happened was her father found out, her brother found out, her husband found out, her boyfriend found out, and then he goes get the good old boys and they go lynch him. Ida B. Wells found this out when she got involved in the anti-lynching campaign. Ida B. Wells got involved in 1892 in the anti-lynching campaign because of the Moss store murders that took place in Memphis, Tennessee. And her friend Tom Moss, who owned the People's Grocery Store there, he and two of his friends, they were lynched. Okay, they were shot and killed, but it was unjust killing. They were taken from jail. What happened was you had a white grocer, a white grocery store owner, who was jealous of Tom Moss, M-O-S-S, because his business was doing well, and he was taking away some of the white grocery store owners' customers. So the grocery store owner, the white store owner, he sends some off-duty deputy sheriffs one night to Tom Moss's store to trash the place. Well, they didn't know that Tom Moss was there, and he was there with two of his friends. So he and two of his friends, they fight back and they shoot back. But they didn't know these were off-duty deputy sheriffs they were shooting at, okay? So they're going to end up being arrested, taken to jail, and a white mob one night comes and breaks them out of jail and takes them out to a stockyard or something, takes them out and kills them, executes them. Okay, so Ida B. Wells, who's a newspaper editor, and she was a teacher, things like this, a real Renaissance woman. So Ida B. Wells, you know, all the African Americans there are furious. And Ida B. Wells writes in the newspaper, she talks about every Negro needs to have a Winchester rifle in his home to protect himself. But she starts doing research on lynchings and the cause of lynchings, okay? And she finds out that a lot of the lynchings were because a white woman said that this black man raped her, tried to rape her, what have you. But she found out that a lot of the sexual interaction between white men and African American men, it was consensual sex as opposed to rape. This is what they find out also when you research the Wilmington Massacre in Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898 also, okay? So you're going to see it's just a few reasons why these massacres take place. It's either over political power and African Americans trying to vote, or it's something dealing with white women and sex, or it's over jobs, okay? Or it's over jobs and African Americans fighting to gain employment, fighting to gain entrance to unions. It's something it's something over jobs. White men feeling that African American men are trying to take their jobs, things like this. After you stole our land, because we were here before Native Americans even came into existence. And if you read The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence by Dr. David Imhotep, he clearly breaks this down. So you got to read this book, because I hear a lot of people talking, and this is why, you know, next year is the 400th year anniversary of them telling us that African people first came to this land. Even though August 20th, 1619 did happen, and that Dutch warship, which was actually an English warship, 20 some odd Negroes coming to Jamestown, Virginia, August 20th, 1619. That did happen. But African people have been in this land we call the United States of America going back at least 51,700 years. Those were the Khoisan. The Khoisan have the oldest DNA on the planet. They come from southern Africa. They're also known, they're the ancestors to the Ainu and the Twa. The Twa in European anthropology and archaeology are derisively, pejoratively, negatively referred to as pygmies. The Khoisan are the short-statured people. They go all around the world. They have the oldest DNA on the planet. Name of this book, once again, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence by Dr. David Imhotep. He has a PhD in ancient African history. The book has 713 footnotes. And when I first found out about him back in 2011, I think it was, I said, brother, your book is single-handedly destroy white supremacy and racism. Okay? So, and if here on our Facebook page, if you see the DVD bundle pack that we have going on right now, the Africans That Were Here Before Columbus DVD bundle pack. It's an 8 DVD bundle pack of some of my lectures and some others. It includes the double lecture he and I did together here in Detroit. Okay, so that's available at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. It's an 8 DVD bundle pack which will blow you away. It's called The Africans That Were Here Before Columbus. And just so we're clear, just so we understand, Christopher Columbus or Cristobal Colon or Cristoforo Colombo never came to the land that we call the United States of America. The closest Columbus comes to this land that we call the United States of America, the contiguous 48 states. Contiguous means connected. The closest he came to this land was Cuba, which is 90 miles away. Columbus never came to this land we call the United States of America. So when I teach, when I do my online courses, and you can register for those at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. They're all on demand. It's I deal with ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. But I show you where Columbus went on his 4 voyages, okay? I show you where Columbus went on his 4 voyages, so you can see that he never came to this land we call the United States of America. However, he did have a huge impact on this land, because one of the reasons is because Columbus helps to lay the foundation for slavery, racism, capitalism, and exploitation of indigenous people. He's conquering land for the Spanish crown, for Spain. Florida and South Carolina were Spanish territory. Okay, here the Spanish were taking Africans into the territory we today call South Carolina in the 1520s. This is about 100 years before Jamestown, Virginia, August 20th, 1619. This is 100 years before that, okay? So even if you just looked at enslaved Africans, we didn't first come here August 20th, 1619. They don't talk about the Spanish. They just talk about the British colonies. Juan Garrido, who was of African descent, comes into Florida in 1513 with Juan Ponce de Leon, who was the Spanish conquistador. So Juan Garrido, an African man, he comes in 1513. But the Moors lose control. The Africans known as the Moors, they lose control of their last stronghold in Spain, Grenada, January 2nd, 1492. And you're going to have African Moors, some are fleeing Spain and the Spanish territories. And some are being enslaved, conquered and enslaved. And they're taken into Spanish territories and enslaved. And they're taken into Florida, South Carolina. These were Spanish territories. Okay? So, when you have some people who say, well, all the slaves that were brought here, all the Africans who were brought here as slaves, did not come from Africa. Europeans were taking them from Europe and bringing them here. That's partly true. It's the way you phrase it. They came from Africa. They just didn't come directly from Africa. Because when you study the Moors going into the Iberian Peninsula, which today we call Spain and Portugal, they're going in through Morocco. If you look at a map, Spain and Portugal, because it wasn't called Spain and Portugal when they go in 711 AD. It was called the Iberian Peninsula. But if you look at a map, Spain and Portugal are right above Morocco. Okay? So they didn't come directly from Africa, but they came from Africa. Okay? They came, it was just further back. All right? So different things are happening at the same time. The transatlantic slave trade is taking place, and Africans are being brought from Africa, and they're being taken into the Spanish territories, Cuba, Haiti, Puerto Rico, what they call it, Santo Domingo, before it was Haiti, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, Honduras, Panama. The Spanish are taking Africans into these territories, 1. 2, they are kicking out Africans who were in Spain, okay? And some of them are being enslaved. So you have different things happening at the same time. All right, you have to understand this. All of us, or all of our ancestors, did not come here necessarily the same way, and there was an African presence in this land we call the United States of America, going back tens of thousands of years, at least 51,700 years. There were pyramid mounds built up and down the Mississippi River by the Khoisan, by the early mound builders. There's a African presence from ancient Egypt here as well. Okay, so you have to. So when I teach about the transatlantic slave trade, and the way I was taught by people like Professor Kabahaya Kamene, Booker T. Coleman is one of my teachers. You may have seen some of my interviews with him. He taught me to understand the existence of something, you must first understand the pre-existence of existence. Okay? So when I was taking my Africana Studies classes over 20 years ago at Wayne State University, they started in like the late 1400s, early 1500s with our history. Now, I was already studying Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen and Dr. John Henry Clark and Dr. Naeem Akbar and Dr. Wade Nobles and Tony Browder. I was studying ancient Kemet and ancient Egypt and Nubia. I was studying that before I took my first class. So I'm like, well, wait a second, hold on. How we just skip over thousands of years of history and we start, in the late 1400s, we start with slavery. We're starting with, we're talking about Ghana, Shanghai, and Mali, which we should talk about. But it's how we skip over all that history. Okay, but, that's the way it was back then. Okay, so... All right. Okay, let's continue. How's everybody doing? All right. And Christopher said, Blue Wave 2018. We the people know. Hashtag Native African oppression no more. And if you look in North Dakota, you have Republicans trying to suppress the Native American vote. Now, you're desperate when you try to suppress the Native American vote on land that you stole from them. I mean, that's talk about a basket of deplorables. Okay. All right, let's continue. Be sure to visit our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, because we have a lot of information there like this for you. Okay. So let's continue here. And what I was going to say, last thing is, so when I teach about the transatlantic slave trade, I don't deal with the last 500 years of history. I deal with the last 50,000 years of history at least, and go back before then, so we can see how a sequence of historical events leads up to the transatlantic slave trade happening. And the reason why, and you have to deal with the 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors. The reason why is because the dehumanization process, the dehumanization process of African people that allowed Europeans to enslave them, that allowed Europeans to see them as being subhuman. That process didn't start in the 1500s. That process goes back to Europe when the Moors are there. And in about the 13th century, the way the Moors are referred to, especially in Spain, becomes changed, and they start being referred to in a negative connotation. They start being referred to as Moristos, which is like calling them a boy. Like in Jim Crow era, they called black men boy. The way that the Moors, because see, early on the Moors were looked at as being superhuman. We know that you had statues of the Black Madonna and child worship all throughout Europe, which comes from Isis, Auset, the first holy trinity of Osar, Auset, and Heru, who the Greeks called Osiris, Isis, and Horus. But the Moors are introducing mathematics, they're introducing algebra, the periodic tables that they call alchemy, or they introduce alchemy, which we call chemistry, and they introduce the periodic tables. They introduce cotton, sugar, alcohol. They introduce all types of foods. When they go in, Europe is about 85 to 90% of Europeans are illiterate. They're teaching Europeans how to read and write. The first university in Europe, it was the University of Salamanca in Spain, built about 1285 AD by African Moors and Arabs. So it's the teachings that these Africans take into Europe that brings Europe out of the Dark Ages. And the Moors are taking the teachings from ancient Kemet, largely coming from ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt. They're taking these teachings into Europe. So this is going to bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. And their teachings are going to form the foundation of what is known as Freemasonry. Okay? And we know that 50 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. And these were British colonies. They're coming from England. This information What the Moors taking to Europe is going to spread throughout Europe, and it brings Europe out of the Dark Ages. It allows them to start sailing again. The Moors are going to reintroduce the concept of longitude and latitude, nautical instruments that Columbus is using on his 4 voyages. He set sail August 3rd, 1492 on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Nautical instruments that Columbus is using were based upon Moorish technology, based upon the nautical instruments that the Moors are taking into Europe. They introduce spherical globes. They introduce almanacs. Okay, so they're taking the light from Africa into the dark continent. Africa was not the dark continent. Europe was the dark continent. Europe was in the Dark Ages. Europe was in the Dark Ages, which came about because of the Vandals and the Visigoths in 476 AD crushing the western portion of the Roman Empire. Okay, so Europe is in the Dark Ages. Is a period of hundreds of years of ignorance, disease, and then you have the Black Death or the bubonic plague that hit Europe in 1347 AD, and it hits in spurts from 1347 to 1400. So Europe loses somewhere between 25 to 75 million people. They lose between 1/4 to 1/3 of their population. It's going to be the Moors and the teachings from the Moors that's going to save Europe. And all this came back to kick us in the behind, because one of the things that Columbus is searching for on his 4 voyages, he's trying to, he claimed he was trying to find a route to the east by going west. But one of the things he's looking for is another source of sugar, because the Moors introduced sugar into Europe, and a lot of Europeans had gotten hooked on sugar. But sugar grows, you need a tropical climate for sugar to grow. So when Columbus uncovers the land in Cuba, in Jamaica, and Haiti, and Puerto Rico, the climate in those areas is conducive to growing sugar cane. So they're going to have huge sugarcane plantations in these Spanish colonies, these Spanish territories. And the life expectancy of African slaves on these sugarcane plantations were only just a few years. I mean, they literally worked them to death. And they would take the sugar, and this became a commodity that they could sell to other countries. But there was also demand for that in Spain as well, for the sugar also. So Columbus, in addition to trying to find gold and silver, things like this, and other spices, he's also trying to find another source of sugar, which became extremely important because sugar was the dominant crop before cotton became the dominant crop. Okay, unfortunately, the Moors introduced cotton into Europe also around 10th century AD as well. So all those things that we introduced into Europe came back to kick us in the behind in more ways than one. You all should really read the book Golden Age of the Moor, edited by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. Golden Age of the Moor, edited by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. This is probably one of the best books dealing with the history of the Moors in medieval Europe. So I think you try to get that from his website or something like that. His widow runs his website, because on Amazon they want about $300 for this book. Okay, I think it's out of print, but you want to get that Golden Age of the Moor. Okay, so let's continue here. This is a little background history to understand. And as Dr. John Henry Clarke taught us, all history is a current event. Everything that's ever happened continues to happen in some shape, form, or fashion. All right, so Emerson Bentley was the 18-year-old white male Republican from the North. He works for the newspaper. He's an editor for the newspaper. He's also a school teacher to African-American children in 1868. Okay, so Southern white Democrats were nowhere near willing to concede the power that they had held for decades before the Civil War. Okay, and in St. Landry Parish there in Louisiana, one of the largest and most populous parishes in the state, thousands of white men were eager to take up arms to defend their political power. They were eager to take up arms to defend their political power. Okay? So what happened was, and once again, this, when you see them, you read about them willing to take up arms to defend their political power. You have white militia groups that are going down to the Mexican border armed to protect America from moms in flip-flops carrying babies coming from Central America. But they're fleeing horrific conditions in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, that the U.S., because of U.S. policies in Central America for the last 50 years, the U.S. has a large part involved in creating the conditions these people are fleeing from. Okay? They're seeking international political asylum, just so people understand. They're seeking international political asylum. International political asylum is international law that the U.S. was involved in making. That's different than undocumented immigrants. When they seek political asylum, that is international law. That's legal. Okay? Read the article from Vice.com. The violence Central American migrants are fleeing was stoked by the U.S. The violence Central American migrants are fleeing was stoked by the U.S. We're still dealing with the aftermath of atrocities committed by U.S. allies in Central America during the Cold War. And this deals with some of the history of U.S. policies and U.S. intervention into Central American countries. Like in 1954, the CIA was involved in overthrowing the democratically elected leader in Guatemala in 1954. And the U.S. was involved in destabilizing a lot of these countries in their economies. Okay, so now when people are fleeing from the conditions that the U.S. was involved in creating, now Trump wants to point at those people and call them criminals. Okay, but this is a case of the chickens coming back home to roost. That's what that is. That's a case of the chickens coming back home to roost. All right. So the summer of 1868 was a tumultuous summer. The summer of 1868. With the help of tens of thousands of black citizens who finally had the right to vote, Republicans handily won local and state elections that spring. Okay? And Henry Clay Warmoth, W-A-R-M-O-T-H, a Republican, won the race for state governor. Okay, the state of Louisiana. But the votes African Americans cast for those elections cost them. They cost them a heavy price. So over the summer, armed white men harassed African American families, shot at them outside of Opelousas, and killed them. So Opelousas was the largest city in St. Landry Parish in Louisiana. They shot and killed men, women, and children with impunity. Editors of the Democratic newspapers there repeatedly warned of dire consequences if the Republican Party continued winning victories at the polls. Okay, so those editorials spurred Democrats to action and instigated violence everywhere, wrote Henry Clay Warmoth in his book War, Politics, and Reconstruction, Stormy Days in Louisiana. Okay, and he said secret Democratic organizations were formed and all armed. We had the Knights of the White Camellia, the Ku Klux Klan, and an Italian organization called the Innocents, I-N-N-O-C-E-N-T-S, who nightly paraded the streets of New Orleans and the roads in the country parishes, producing terror among the Republicans, end quote. Okay. Now, when I talk about the Democrats here, I'm dealing with history. Okay. I'm not saying that African Americans should not be Democrats because of this history, because most people who make that assertion and they talk about the Klan with Democrats, things like this. They don't talk about the Klan members like later in the 1920s who were Republicans in the South. But they also don't deal with the history of why we switched from being Republicans to Democrats. So I deal with all of that history. I talked about that last night on my radio show. So if you missed the broadcast, you can go back and watch it on Facebook, the African History Network on Facebook. Click on videos. And then also I put it on our YouTube channel early this morning, because I didn't leave the radio station until about 2 in the morning, because I was on Pastor Mo's show, who comes on after my show. I was on his show. He goes off at 1 a.m. So it's on my YouTube channel also, Michael Imhotep. Watch that as well. And I also dealt with Malcolm X, the Ballad of the Bullet, and Malcolm talking about African Americans being traitors who were part of the Democratic Party. But I dealt with the history after that, and I broke down what Malcolm was saying as well. Because today, those traitors would be the black people running around with Make America Great Again hats. If you understand that Republicans control the House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, and the White House, and you understand the harm that their policies are doing to African Americans, and how Trump has reversed over 100 policies President Obama had in place, then if you understand what Malcolm was saying, he would be talking about black Republicans today. So, editors of the Democratic newspapers repeatedly warned of dire consequences if the Republican Party continued winning victories at the polls. Okay, those editorials spurred Democrats to action and instigated violence everywhere. Now, the vigilante groups were so widespread that they often included nearly every white man in the region. One Democratic newspaper editor estimated that more than 3,000 men belonged to the Knights of the White Camellia of St. Landry Parish, an area that included only 13,776 white people in total, including women and children. Okay, so he estimated that more than 3,000 white men belonged to the Knights of the White Camellia, okay, in St. Landry Parish, and there were only 13,776 white elections. With the approach of the presidential elections in November of 1868, okay, the tension only increased. On September 13th, 1868, the Republicans held a meeting in the town of Washington, Louisiana, not far from Opelousas, and found streets. All right, I don't know what happened. The internet's acting up. Okay, so the vigilante groups were so wide. How's everybody doing? Share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in also. The vigilante groups were so widespread that they often included nearly every white man in the region. Okay. Now, with the approach of the presidential elections in November of 1868, the tension only increased. On September 13th, 1868, the Republicans held a meeting in the town of Washington, not far from Opelousas, and found streets lined with armed Seymour Knights. Okay, this white supremacist organization, the Seymour Knights. A misfired rifle nearly caused a riot to break out. A misfired rifle nearly caused a riot to break out. But in the end, everyone departed peacefully. Though the Democrats threatened Emerson Bentley if he failed to publish an honest, quote unquote, honest account of the event in the St. Landry Progress, the newspaper. Sure enough, they used Emerson Bentley's account in which he wrote the men had been intimidating the Republicans to instigate a wave of violence on September 28th, 1868. Okay. So, displeased with the way Emerson Bentley had portrayed the Democrats John Williams, James R. Dixon, who later became a local judge, and Constable Sebastian May, M-A-Y, visited Emerson Bentley's schoolhouse to make good on the anonymous threats of the earlier September note. Okay, in that September note said EB, the initials EB for Emerson Bentley, beware KKK. Okay. And the note had illustrated a coffin, a skull and bones, and a dagger dripping with blood. All right. So you have to understand. See, they don't talk about the Ku Klux Klan and these other white supremacist organizations at the time, how they were attacking white Republicans and killing white Republicans. So the Ku Klux Klan from 1882 to 1964, they lynched about 3,400 African Americans, but they also lynched 1,297 Republicans. And they were killing Republicans, they were killing Catholics also. And they were killing white Republicans as well. All right. So let's continue. Somebody's sending me a message here. All right, sorry about that. All right, so let's continue here. So they forced Emerson Bentley to sign a retraction of the article. And then James R. Dixon savagely beat Emerson Bentley, sending the children who were sitting for lessons scattering in terror. Rumors spread, and soon many Republicans were convinced Emerson Bentley had been killed, though he managed to escape with his life. As a small number of African Americans prepared to rescue Emerson Bentley, word spread around the parish that a black rebellion was imminent. Word spread around the parish that a black rebellion was imminent. Thousands of white men began arming themselves and raiding houses around the area. St. Landrians reacted to armed Negroes and rumors of uprising in the same manner that Southerners had reacted for generations, wrote historian Carolyn de Latte in 1976. Quote, if anything, the vengeance visited upon the Negro population was greater, as blacks were no longer protected by any consideration of their monetary value, end quote. So they're saying during slavery, even though slavery is bad, there was some type of consideration of the monetary value that African slaves had to the slave owner in some instances, right? But now, the monetary value was not a consideration because you were not owned by a slave master. Now, you had sharecropping that existed, but you weren't, that's like semi-slavery, but you weren't owned by a master. So this is, they're showing the difference here. Blacks were no longer protected by any consideration of their monetary value, end quote. So on the first night, only one small group of armed African Americans assembled to deal with the report they had heard about Emerson Bentley, because they think that Emerson Bentley is dead. They don't know that he was severely beaten, but they don't know that he escaped. They think he's dead. Okay. Now they were met by an armed group of white men mounted on horses outside of Opelousas. Of those white men, 29 were taken to the of those men, 29 were taken to the local prison, and 27 of them were summarily executed. Okay, and they're talking about the African Americans who assembled to deal with this report. Okay, they were met by a group of armed white men mounted on horses. So the bloodshed continued for 2 weeks. This massacre continued for 2 weeks, with African American families killed in their homes, shot in public, and chased down by vigilante groups. So the other editor of the St. Landry Parish, which was the Republican newspaper, his name was C.E. Durand. The initials C.E. and then Durand, D-U-R-A-N-D. He was murdered in the early days of the massacre, and his body displayed outside of the Opelousas drugstore. By the end of the 2 weeks, estimates of the number killed were around 250, and the vast majority of them were African Americans. When the Bureau of Freedmen, which was the government organization I talked about, created to provide emancipated African Americans with legal, health, and educational assistance and help them settle abandoned lands. When the Freedmen's Bureau sent Lieutenant Jesse Lee to investigate, he called it, quote, a quiet reign of terror so far as the freed people were concerned, end quote. Influential Republican Beverly Wilson, an African-American blacksmith in Opelousas, believed black citizens were, quote, in a worse condition now than in slavery, end quote. Okay, this is what Beverly Wilson said. She was a influential Republican, and she was a blacksmith as well in Opelousas. She believed black citizens were, quote, in a worse condition now than in slavery, end quote. Now, another observer was led outside the town of Opelousas and shown the half-buried bodies of more than a dozen African Americans. But Democratic newspapers, the only remaining sources of news in the region, because all of the Republican newspapers had been burned, they had been destroyed, okay? The Democratic newspapers downplayed the horrific violence. Quote, the people generally are well satisfied with the result of the St. Landry riot. Only they regret that the carpetbaggers escaped, end quote, wrote Daniel Dennett, D-E-N-N-E-T, Daniel Dennett, editor of the Democratic Franklin Planters Banner, which was one of the Democratic newspapers there. Quote, the editor escaped, and 100 dead Negroes and perhaps 100 more wounded and crippled. A dead white radical, a dead Democrat, and 3 or 4 wounded Democrats are the upshot of the business, end quote. Now, the groups managed to achieve their ultimate purpose, as was borne out by the results of the November 1868 presidential elections. Even though Republican nominee Ulysses Grant won, okay, hero of the Civil War for the Union, even though Republican nominee Ulysses Grant won, not a single Republican vote was counted in St. Landry Parish. Those who oversaw the election, quote, fully convinced that no man on that day could have voted any other than the Democratic ticket and not been killed inside of 24 hours thereafter, end quote. Okay, so they're saying they're saying that African Americans realized if they voted for Republicans, they would have been killed within 24 hours. St. Landry Parish illustrates the local shift of power after 1868, where an instance of conservative boss rule occurred and the parish Republican Party was unable to fully recover for the remainder of Reconstruction, writes historian Matthew Christensen. There would be no Republican organization in the parish for the next 4 years and no Republican newspaper until 1876. Now, the Opelousas Massacre also set the stage for acts of violence and intimidation. Okay, lynching became routinized in Louisiana, a systematic way by which whites sought to assert white supremacy in response to African American resistance, said historian Michael Pfeiffer, who's the author of the book The Roots of Rough Justice, Origins of American Lynching. Okay, and he responded by email for this article. He said this would be an important precedent for the subsequent wave of lynchings that occurred in Louisiana from the 1890s through the early decades of the 20th century, in which lynch mobs killed more than 400 persons, most of them African Americans. Okay, he said this would be an important precedent for the subsequent wave of lynchings that occurred in Louisiana from the 1890s through the early decades of the 20th century, in which lynch mobs killed more than 400 people, most of them African Americans. So 1896, you have Plessy versus Ferguson, U.S. Supreme Court case, which legalizes Jim Crow laws, okay? And after that, you're going to have a increase in racial violence, increase in lynchings that take place, and we see this going into the early 1900s. Now, 1915 is critical, okay? The year 1915 is critical, and the reason why is because February 8th, 1915, the movie The Birth of a Nation debuts. And the movie The Birth of a Nation takes place, so 1915 is the 50th anniversary of the ending of the Civil War and 4 million enslaved Africans being freed from chattel slavery. And you still had a lot of people who were bitter in the South, okay, over the Civil War and what happened. So the movie The Birth of a Nation takes place in Piedmont, South Carolina. And it deals with a white family that are slave owners, okay? It takes place during slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. And after the Civil War ends, during Reconstruction, they show Union Negro soldiers coming into this town in South Carolina, taking over the town and suppressing white people and pushing white people around. They show African Americans in Congress, being congressmen, things like this. And all of the negative, stereotypical, dehumanizing images of African Americans are shown in this movie, The Birth of a Nation. All right, it's directed by D.W. Griffith. Is distributed by a man named Louis B. Mayer. Louis B. Mayer takes the profits he makes from distributing this film, The Birth of a Nation, and he teams up with 2 other men named Metro and Goldwyn, and they form Metro Goldwyn Mayer Studios, MGM Studios. D.W. Griffith teams up with Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks and one other person, and they create United Artists Studios. Okay, this is after The Birth of a Nation comes out. So the movie ends with the Ku Klux Klan rising up and putting down this rebellion from the Union Negro soldiers. Okay, the Ku Klux Klan are the heroes of this movie, The Birth of a Nation. And in the movie, it shows, now they have, most of the African American characters in the movie are white men or white people in blackface. Okay, and this goes back to blackface, and Megyn Kelly just happened a couple weeks ago, right? And she doesn't know why blackface is wrong. Okay, you need a history lesson. All right, and Roland Martin gave her a history lesson, but I think Megyn already knew. Megyn Kelly has a history of saying very racially insensitive and white supremacist things when she was on Fox News. So the Ku Klux Klan were the heroes of the movie. That movie single-handedly rejuvenated the Ku Klux Klan, which had pretty much died out for the most part by 1915, because a lot of the Civil War veterans, a lot of them had died by 1915. You're talking about 50 years after the Civil War ends. A lot of the early members of the Klan had died out, things like this. So the Klan hadn't completely died out, but it had largely died out by 1915. That movie is going to rejuvenate the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, so much so that in newspapers where they had newspaper ads promoting the movie, The Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan oftentimes would take out recruiting ads for the Ku Klux Klan next to the ad for the movie The Birth of a Nation. So you're going to see, now this is during the beginning of the Great Migration, 1915. This is during the second year of World War I. And we're going to see the Klan grow in power. going into the late teens and into the 1920s. We're going to see the Klan grow in power and in their number as well. Okay, so let's continue. And if you like this type of information, hey, visit our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, okay? And, you know, we have my DVD lectures there. We have the bundle pack, the Africans that came before Columbus. We have, for our children, we have the Mailtrek animated series, which is an animated cartoon that teaches our children their history. This deals with exploring ancient Africa. And the other one deals with exploring pre-Columbian America, who was here before Europeans got here. And we have, you can buy those individually. I also have them in the bundle pack. And we also have the Mailtrek full color, storybook exploring ancient Africa. And it has a glossary in the back of terms also. They deal with ancient Egypt and Nubia, things like this, Abyssinia. They deal with Ghana, Songhai, and Mali as well. And then we have the Mailtrek coloring book for our children also. Okay. So this is all available at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. We sell those in the bundle pack. Also, I think the bundle pack's like $80. You get some other cartoons with it as well. And you can also donate to the African History Network at paypal.me/the AHN show. paypal.me/the AHN show. And that helps us to keep doing the research, stay on the air, pay the bills, etc. This is a lot of research. There's a lot of time. And also helps us keep doing the radio show as well, because there's a lot of research and time putting together those shows. All right, so let's continue here. We're dealing with the Opelousas Massacre of 1868, which took place in the Reconstruction Era, and over 200 African Americans were killed because of this, and they were killed because they were trying to vote and join a local Democratic Party there. So if anybody tells you we did not die for the right to vote, they have a very poor understanding of history. This is not the only massacre like this either. Okay, so Michael Pfeiffer, the author of the book The Roots of Rough Justice, Origins of American Lynching, said, quote, "This would be an important precedent for the subsequent wave of lynchings that occurred in Louisiana from the 1890s through the early decades of the 20th century, in which lynch mobs killed more than 400 people, people, most of them African American. Now, yet for all that it was the deadliest instance of racial violence during the Reconstruction period, the Opelousas Massacre is little remembered today. Only slightly better known is the 1873 Colfax Massacre, in which an estimated 60 to 150 people were killed, a massacre largely following the pattern set by Opelousas. Okay, and that's research the Colfax, C-O-L-F-A-X, the Colfax Massacre of 1873 as well. That's another massacre as well. So there's a history of us being killed trying to exercise our right to vote. So when I hear people say, you know, we didn't die for the right to vote, I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? You know, I don't know where you did your research, but that's not true. Even if you go to 1965 in Montgomery, Alabama, and Jimmy Lee Jackson being killed at a rally, fighting for the right to vote, and he's shot by state troopers. He dies like 8 days later. He's trying to protect his mother. Okay, so you know, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. James Cheney was the African American man who was born in Mississippi. He was with them. He was killed. They were killed by the Klan. They were down there registering African Americans to vote. This is in Philadelphia, Mississippi. So I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Maybe you should, you know, come talk to me or something. I don't know where you're getting this information from. There's an overwhelming history, overwhelming evidence of this. So I don't know. Okay, let's continue here. How's everybody doing? Okay, so the United States has done comparatively little until quite recently to memorialize its history of significant violence, Michael Pfeiffer said, the author of The Roots of Rough Justice, Origins of American Lynching. He said Reconstruction remains contested in local memory, and efforts to remember the achievements of Reconstruction are canceled out by the seeming failure of the period to achieve lasting change. Okay, he said Reconstruction remains contested in local memory, and efforts to remember the achievements of Reconstruction are canceled out by the seeming failure of the period to achieve lasting change. Okay, and that's an article there from SmithsonianMag.com, which is the official website of the Smithsonian Institute. It's called The Deadliest Massacre in Reconstruction Era, Louisiana. The deadliest massacre in Reconstruction Era, Louisiana happened 150 years ago. In September 1868, Southern white Democrats hunted down around 200 African Americans in an effort to suppress voter turnout. All right. So at the beginning of this broadcast, I talked about why African Americans switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, and we see that taking place in the late 1920s. Especially, we see the shift and the foundation for that taking place in the late 1920s, especially in 1928, when Herbert Hoover wins the Republican nomination to run for president. He's running against Northern Democrat Al Smith, which is different than the Southern Democrats, which were the Dixiecrats, the obstructionist Dixiecrats that Malcolm talks about. And this is the Southern Dixiecrats, those obstructionists. These were the ones who were filibustering for 75 days the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, so when we hear Malcolm talk about the Battle of the Bullet, because I see Malcolm around this time of year, people, or around this time when election time comes, people bring up Malcolm's speech, the Battle of the Bullet, him talking about Democrats and things like this, and him saying that you're a traitor to your race if you walk around here showing allegiance to a party that controls 2/3 of the government, etc. Right? They never put this in historical context about what Malcolm is talking about. They never put this in historical context. The reason why is largely because the people who bring this up and make these arguments don't understand history. This is why. Okay, so let me explain this to you. I dealt with this last night on my show. Go back and watch that broadcast. Facebook Live on Facebook, the African History Network. Click on videos. That was from November 4th, and then it's uploaded to our YouTube channel. I did that early this morning, like around 1 a.m., 1:30 a.m. Michael Imhotep on YouTube. But since I'm talking about this now, I'm just going to share this briefly with you. And it's important to deal with this topic because it came up because of the Young Leadership Summit that Candace Owens and Charlie Kirk from Turning Point USA organized. They had it at the White House. It was their 3-day summit, okay, and they had it at the White House. And Roland Martin was there, and you saw some coverage, you saw some articles we posted about it. But this was for young black conservatives, 15 years old to 35 years old. A lot of them are confused. They're wearing "Make America Great Again" hats. A lot of them have a very poor understanding of history. And that's not me saying that. That's Roland saying that, who was there talking to them. Okay? But there's an article from thegrio.com, thegrio.com, GRIO, called "Young Black Conservatives Stand for Trump at White House Leadership Summit." So this summit was like October 26th through the 28th, Friday through Sunday. Okay? And in this article, they interviewed some of the people, some of the African Americans who were there at the Leadership Summit. But they talked to this one sister named Beverlyn Beatty, B-E-A-T-T-Y. If you know her, tell her I said hi. Beverlyn Beatty. And Beverlyn was dressed in bright red from head to toe, a look both fit in with the Make America Great Again hats. And you should check those tags in those hats, because half of them are made in China, which doesn't even make sense. You're talking about Make America Great Again with a hat made in China. Okay. And she stood out amongst the sea of black suits. She was dressed in red. Her voice echoed across the street when she spoke passionately about why she chose to vote for Donald Trump. She said, quote, "I got so much ridicule. I was called a disgrace to my people. And let me tell you something. It was predominantly white people who told me this." Those were some woke white people. She said, "Now I'm not a racist now. I love my white people, but let's make something very clear. When you have a white person tell you how to think because you're black, that is racism. No, that's called them knowing a crazy white man when they see one. That's what that is." So she goes on to try to paraphrase Malcolm X, which is a mistake if you don't understand history. So she said, quote, "Malcolm X said it very clear. Any African Americans who vote for liberals that have continued to make promises and yet have not done anything and have not kept to their promises are a chump and a disgrace to your race," end quote. So she goes on to say, "We're not a disgrace. We're not angry black people. We're not people that are stupid. We are not dumb." Could have fooled me. Look at all these educated faces. She said, "I came here and I was like, wow, all these black conservatives." Okay. So you're telling me I'm not the only one. All right. So she brought in Malcolm. So let's deal with this. So she's paraphrasing Malcolm from his speech, "The Ballot or the Bullet." The Ballot or the Bullet. Now, he delivered two versions of the Ballot or the Bullet. The first one was April 3rd, 1964 in Cleveland, Ohio. The second one was the next day in Detroit, Michigan, April 4th, 1964. It's the one in Detroit where he talks about you being a traitor to your race for belonging to the Democratic Party when they did not deliver upon their promise. Now, it's important to understand chronology, because when people put I saw somebody posted an article today from realclearpolitics.com about Malcolm saying, they're talking about Malcolm and 80% of the African Americans voting Democratic, 80% of them, and not getting something in return for their vote. That article is poorly written. It's written by somebody who does not understand history, because they did not put that into historical context, okay? So first of all, this speech was delivered the month after Malcolm officially separated from the Nation of Islam. He separated from the Nation of Islam officially March 8th, 1964, okay? March 26, 1964, Malcolm went to the U.S. Senate debate for the Civil Rights Act of 64. Is that Senate debate that he meets Dr. King for the first and only time. So all the pictures of that you see of Dr. King and Malcolm together, that's from March 26, 1964. Malcolm tells Dr. King, "I'm going to throw all my effort, all my heart into the civil rights movement," because what people don't say is that Malcolm joined the civil rights movement and helped to radicalize the civil rights movement when he leaves the Nation of Islam. And if you actually read his speech, "The Ballot or the Bullet," and you could read the one from April 4th, 1964 in Detroit, he talks about joining the civil rights movement and radicalizing the civil rights movement. Okay? That whole part of Malcolm gets left out. So what Malcolm said was, let's play this clip here from Malcolm, let you hear it.
You're the one who sent Kennedy to Washington. You're the one who put the present Democratic administration in Washington, D.C. The whites were evenly divided. It was the fact that you threw 80% of your votes behind the Democrats that put the Democrats in the White House. When you see this, you can see that the Negro vote is the key factor. And despite the fact that you are...
Let me turn on the speakers so you can hear it better.
The Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because of the Negro vote. They've been down there 4 years. Negro vote. They've been down there 4 years. And you're the one who put the present Democratic administration in Washington, D.C. The whites were evenly divided. It was the fact that you threw 80% of your votes behind the Democrats that put the Democrats in the White House. When you see this, you can see that the Negro vote is the key factor. And despite the fact that you are in a position to be the determining factor, what do you get out of it? The Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because of the Negro vote. They've been down there 4 years. And all other legislation they wanted to bring up, they brought it up and gotten it out of the way, and now they bring up you. And now they bring up you. You put them first and they put you last. Because you're a chump. A political chump. In Washington, D.C., in the House of Representatives, there are 257 who are Democrats. Only 177 are Republican. In the Senate, there are 67 Democrats. Only 33 are Republicans. The party that you best controls 2/3 of the House of Representatives in the Senate, and still they can't keep their promise to you because you're a chump. Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you're dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race.
All right, so that's Malcolm, April 3rd, 1964 in Detroit. He doesn't say that exactly in the speech he delivered in Cleveland, Ohio the day before. So if you have this book here, Malcolm X Speaks, edited by George Braitman. Okay, if you have this book, they have transcripts of Malcolm's speeches after he leaves the Nation of Islam. The Battle of the Bullet is one of them. That was delivered. The version of the speech they have here is one from Cleveland, Ohio, April 3rd, 64. It's a little different. Most people don't know there are two speeches. Number one, okay, I teach history, so this is how I know this. And I've read both of them, okay? That speech that I just played, you can find that on YouTube, number one. Number two, you can get the transcript of it from digitalhistory.uh.edu, digitalhistory.uh.edu, because you have to read it, okay? So, this speech, like I said, this is the month after Malcolm left the Nation of Islam. Now, this speech was before the Civil Rights Act of 64 was signed into law, because when he's giving this speech, the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, which are not the same as the Northern Democrats, the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, who were the obstructionists, they launched a 75-day filibuster of the Civil Rights Act, okay? You should be able to share this. If you can't share it now, you can share it when I'm done. I'm not sure why you should be. I don't know why it's not letting you share it. But when I'm done, you'll be able to share it, share this broadcast. Okay, now here's the most important part. So this is before the Civil Rights Act is passed. Malcolm is saying this, okay? Malcolm dies before the Voting Rights Act of 65 is signed into law. Malcolm is assassinated February 21st, 1965. The Voting Rights Act is not signed into law till August 6, 1965. The month after that, you have Executive Order 11246, which is known as affirmative action, signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. Malcolm is assassinated before all this happens, okay? So this is why I tell people, when you quote Malcolm, you have to understand context and chronology. Okay, so one, Malcolm said, he talked about how many Democrats were in the House of Representatives. He said there are 257 who are Democrats, 177 who are Republicans in the House of Representatives. Then he said there are in the U.S. Senate, there's 67 Democrats and only 33 Republicans, okay? And he said the party that you back controls 2/3 of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, he really didn't go through the history of why African Americans switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, because there were legitimate reasons that we did that. Okay, but then he goes on to say, he says the party that you back controls 2/3 of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and still they can't keep their promise to you. Okay, because you're a chump. Now, he goes on to say, anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you're dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race. All right, well, who controls the U.S. House of Representatives today? It's about 239 Republicans and 193, 194 Democrats. So Republicans control the House of Representatives. You need 218 votes in the House to get anything passed. Who controls the U.S. Senate today? It's 51 Republicans, 47 Democrats, 2 independents. Senator Angus King and Senator Bernie Sanders are independents. So Republicans control the U.S. Senate also. Who is at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? Trump. He's a Republican. So Republicans control the House of Representatives, they control the U.S. Senate, and they control the White House. They don't need Democratic votes to pass anything if they vote along party lines, if they have they meet the 218 vote threshold. But Republicans are systematically reversing policies President Obama had in place. They're constantly trying to repeal the Affordable Health Care Act. They've cut subsidies for the Affordable Health Care Act to keep prices down. Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, as Attorney General, redeclared the war on drugs May 12, 2017, rescinding Eric Holder's initiative dealing with, back in 2013, dealing with smart on crime, law enforcement, smart on crime policing. They tried to, Sessions, number one, is against the consent decrees and doing investigations into the patterns and practices of police departments. When he was sworn in as Attorney General, he tried to back out of the consent decrees with the Baltimore Police Department and the Chicago Police Department. Okay, and a federal judge intervened and overruled that. They tried to back out, the Department of Justice tried to back out of the lawsuit that the Obama administration was involved in against the state of Texas dealing with voter suppression. The Obama administration took the side of voters, especially African Americans. The Trump Department of Justice took the side of the state of Texas. Because, and also keep in mind that Jeff Sessions is an old Southern segregationist from Alabama. He's the former U.S. Senator from Alabama. 2013, when the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was gutted by the U.S. Supreme Court case of Shelby County versus Holder, Jeff Sessions cheered the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, because the Voting Rights Act totally changed the lives of white Southern segregationists, in the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. That totally changed their lives. You look across the board, they are reversing policies that President Obama had in place. Department of Education, you look at the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, you look at the Department of Justice. They've also gutted the civil rights departments. They've cut the funding to the civil rights departments at these different departments that weakened them. Laid off people, weakened with the type of investigations they can do. All across the board, this is taking place. You look at Trump reversing President Obama's initiative to end contracts for privatized prisons. Okay, so August 2016, President Obama said that they were not going to renew federal contracts for privatized prisons for federal prisoners. Trump reversed that. Why? Because Core Civic, which used to be Corrections Corporation of America, and Geo Group, which used to be Wackenhut, donated almost $600,000 to Donald Trump's presidential campaign. He reversed that. When you look at the contracts to house, for detention centers to house immigrant children coming to this country who are labeled undocumented, right? And we saw what took place a few months ago at the Mexican border. That's a $1 billion industry, okay? providing the prisons, okay, the type of housing for the immigrant children. Core Civic and Geo Group have huge contracts dealing with that. That's a billion-dollar industry. So you look across the board, Trump is systematically reversing these policies, right, that are detrimental to African Americans. So if Malcolm X were alive today, these black people running around here with Make America Great Again hats, those would be the traitors that Malcolm would be talking about, because they're in control of the government. And then also you look at what Trump is doing to the federal bench. When Trump came, there were at least 107 vacancies for the federal bench when Trump won the nomination. So he's made a number. It's something. I think he said something like 145 nominations to the federal bench. That's a lifetime appointment. What Trump is doing is he is nominating very young, ultra-conservative white men to the federal bench to change the whole landscape of the federal bench. It's only in the last maybe 3 or 4 months that this has really been getting any attention, okay? But this is what Trump is doing. And the reason why he was able to do that, and see, this is why Republicans want to maintain control of the U.S. Senate so much. Because even if they lose control of the House, which they should, they can still confirm Supreme Court nominations, because that's the House of that's the U.S. Senate, not the House, and they can still confirm Trump's federal bench nominations. That has nothing to do with the House of Representatives. That's the U.S. Senate. Okay, so these are things that people don't understand, how Trump is systematically going through reversing these policies that President Obama had in place. A lot of people don't know the U.S. prison population dropped to its lowest point in 20 years in December 2015 under President Obama. It dropped from a peak of 2.3 million down to 1.53 million. That's not me. That's the report from the Department of Justice. Newsweek.com had an article about this, detailing this. All of this stuff is easily researchable. If you listen to my radio show, you already know this, because I talk about this on a regular basis, and I provide you the evidence for this, okay? So what happens is that unfortunately people that don't do research keep putting out this nonsense, saying President Obama didn't do anything for black people, things like this. They haven't studied his policies. 2.95 million jobs created for African Americans under the Obama administration. Now keep in mind, when he came into office, we were losing 700,000 to 800,000 jobs a month, the economy, okay? 15.1 million jobs created in the President Obama administration. So Trump likes to talk about the economy, 3.7% unemployment rate. I know in September, the African American unemployment rate was 6%. That's the U3 number. There's 6 different unemployment rates, U1 through U3. Go to bls.gov to get an education on the unemployment rate, how to calculate it. The one that's usually given the first Friday of each month, the one that you hear about in the news, that's usually the U3 number, okay? And that deals with people who have looked for work in the past four weeks, okay? That's the U3 number. So the unemployment rate for African Americans was cut by a little more than half under President Obama. It went from a peak of about 16.7, 16.8% down to 7.8% December 2016. Also, when people talk about the Affordable Health Care Act, people don't realize that 3 million non-elderly African Americans who did not have health insurance got health insurance because of the Affordable Health Care Act. 3 million non-elderly African Americans who did not already have health insurance got it because of the Affordable Health Care Act. The number one reason why people file for bankruptcy is because of health care. Now, these are all policies that African American organizations were fighting for. Just because you were not involved in the fight does not mean that African Americans were not fighting for these policies. Okay? It just means I don't know what you were doing. Also, President Obama paid the $1.2 billion settlement to the black farmers who have been suing the government because they were locked out of loans for farms going back to the New Deal era. in the Farmers Home Administration, which was making low interest loans to farmers so they can pay their mortgages during the Great Depression, keep their farms running, and mechanize their farms. And when they mechanized their farms, they got rid of a lot of black sharecroppers and black tenant farmers that were working for them during the Great Depression. The Great Depression was horrible for white people. It was horrific. I mean, it was even worse for us. Okay. So not only did you have 3 million non-elderly African Americans who got health insurance for the first time because of the Affordable Health Care Act, that lowered the uninsured rate of African Americans to its lowest point in history, down to 10%. And what it did was, because we can get preventative health care, it extended our life expectancy. So the average life expectancy for African Americans increased to 72 and a half years, which is the longest life expectancy for African Americans in the history of this country. This is all because of the Affordable Health Care Act. Not to mention, it created 1 million jobs as well. Okay? So this is a document people should read, because every city I lecture in, even though I talk about this on my radio shows, every city I lectured in, nobody's read it. Detroit, Atlanta, San Diego in August of this year, San Diego, Atlanta, July, the Black Homeschooling Conference. This is called Progress of the African American Community during the Obama Administration. Progress of the African American Community during the Obama Administration. Okay? And this is from whitehouse.gov. This is easily researchable, easily verifiable. And what it does, it goes through and shows you how policies from the Obama administration positively impacted the African American community. Now, the people who say President Obama didn't do anything, they can't tell you none of this stuff because they don't do any research. I listen to what people say, and I just sit back and I just let them talk. I listen to what people say. I can tell they haven't done any research. This is why they don't give you any sources. They never read this document. Now, I found out about this from Andre Michael Eglishon a few years ago, during probably about 2015 or so, 2014, 2015, because it was before President Obama left office. He still had a lot of time left when I first found out about it. He was guest hosting the Reverend Al Sharpton radio show, Keeping It Real, Reverend Al Sharpton's radio show. So he talked about it because people call in, what did Obama do, blah, blah, blah. And he talked about it, so I went and researched it and found it and printed it up, and I use this in my presentations because everywhere I go, nobody's read it. I just find that interesting. And then this document here now there are a number of these, just like the Urban League. This is from January 2017, and most people don't know it existed because I don't know what type of research people are doing. This is the last Obama administration scorecard. This came out January 2017, National Urban League. I printed it up, and this goes through and deals with his policies and the impact that his policies had on African Americans, and they grade them. This one right here, this is a little beat up. This is from the Congressional Black Caucus. This is called What Did Trump Do? The First 100 Days. What did Trump do? The first 100 days. And what this does is it goes through and it shows you how policies from the Trump administration, they go through, look at 100 things. The first 100 days, they look at it. So his policies, his nominations, things like this. First 100 days, and they show you how it negatively impacted the African American community. Okay, this is called. You can get this from CBC, Congressional Black Caucus, cbc.house.gov. What did Trump do? The first 100 days. #Stay woke list. This is good to share with millennials, because a lot of millennials don't know this information. I talked to some of them. A lot of them just don't know. They may be woke, but they ain't that woke. They don't have this type of information here. And they're not dealing with the policies that President Obama had in place that many of them and many of us, even older people, don't know existed, that Trump has systematically reversed and is continuing to do that. And now, after they gave this $1.4 trillion tax cut, Edward said, should black people vote? You goddamn right black people should vote. Hell yeah. I ain't one of these people out here telling black people don't vote. You watch my video, absolutely. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. Once again, politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. And one of the reasons why we're in this predicament of Trump in the last 2 years and all these policy reversals attacking, because you've already had some of us who have lost health care because of him cutting back on the subsidies for the Affordable Health Care Act. This attack that's taking place, okay? You look at what Betsy DeVos is doing with the Department of Education. Now, we knew about Betsy DeVos here in Michigan before you all knew about her, for the most part because she's from Michigan, and her husband, Dick DeVos, who ran for governor a few years ago, they have been funding the charter school initiative, the for-profit charter school initiative here in Michigan, especially in Detroit. So we were trying to tell y'all, no, this woman's crazy. This woman is totally unqualified to be Secretary of Education. She's never worked in the schools. She's never been a teacher. She hasn't been part of the PTA, nothing. She's totally unqualified. But what she's doing, if you look at it, and I've talked about this on my show, she has reversed policies that President Obama had in place dealing with for-profit colleges. A lot of people don't know. The reason why you don't see any more commercials for ITT Tech is because President Obama put them out of business. There were a lot of predatory colleges, for-profit colleges, that were targeting disproportionately African Americans and Hispanics. And what they would do, they would have the commercials on TV, and they call you in for, you know, to tell you about the school, and they have you take out these exorbitant student loans. You go through the program, you get the diploma, the certificate, what have you, and many of them had a poor track record of actually placing people into jobs that had anything to do with the degree that they took out the student loan to get in the first place. So then they're stuck with the student loan debt. They default on the loan, what have you. Okay, so President Obama in the Department of Education, he put a lot of these schools out of business, and some other ones he put like on notice. And they put in place a loan forgiveness plan also. And that was scheduled to go into effect. It was either July of last year or July of this year. Okay. Betsy DeVos tried to back out of that. You had attorney generals in a number of states who sued Trump's Department of Education to enforce this law from President Obama. And the loan forgiveness, they had a loan forgiveness, and there was a backlog of people applying for this. There have been articles written about this. Actually, there's one from thehill.com I could bring up. But this really impacts African American women. Why? Because there was an article that came out a few months ago, and I think theroot.com had an article about this. And it talks about how African American women carry the most student loan debt. So what we don't understand is that a policy does not have to say black or African American for it to benefit you. It's illegal to write a policy that only benefits one race or one group of people, unless maybe it's something dealing with a lawsuit. But what you can do is put policies in place that positively, disproportionately impact people who are negatively, disproportionately impacted by policies. So thehill.com has an article, Judge Rules Against DeVos Rollback of Obama-Era Student Loan Regulations. This is from thehill.com. Read that article. Judge Rules Against DeVos Rollback of Obama-Era Student Loan Regulations. All this stuff is taking place, and they're systematically reversing and trying to reverse policies that President Obama had in place that most of us don't even know existed because we don't do any research. Okay? And AtlantaBlackStar.com had an article. Betsy DeVos elimination of Obama rules allows for-profit colleges to swindle poor black students. Now keep in mind, Betsy DeVos was nominated by Donald Trump. Donald Trump had to pay a $24 million settlement and a $1 million fine for running a fake university in the state of New York called Trump University. And he appoints this woman. He nominates this woman. She was confirmed by the U.S. Senate, which is a whole nother debacle, which is why the U.S. Senate is so important. That's an example of why the U.S. Senate is so important. But he nominates a woman who is lenient and soft on predatory colleges when President Obama was shutting some of those predatory colleges down because they were ripping us off. So these are examples of how elections have consequences. Now, what people didn't know, and unfortunately, you know, you have people running around telling us that we're only 13% of the population, 14% of the population. Okay, we're actually 14% of the U.S. population, 47.4 million African Americans as of June of 2017, because that's the U.S. Census press release that came out June of 2018. Population 47.4 million. But you have people telling us during the election, well, you're only 13% of the population, you're only 14% of the population, your vote doesn't matter. Okay? And that is factually, historically inaccurate. And even when, you know, Dr. Claude Anderson, I love Doc. A lot of people quote him. I actually know him. Dr. Claude Anderson is one of my teachers. I just interviewed him week before last. Okay? On my show, on my radio show. You know, I mean, it was last Sunday. Not this past, it was October 28th. I just interviewed. Go listen to that interview. We have it here on Facebook, the African History Network. Click on videos. We have it. The audio podcast is like you can hear him the best. Because I was able to get the audio straight. I was able to get the audio file straight from the radio station. You can listen to the podcast of our shows. Go to AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Right on the homepage, you see the link, listen to podcasts, and just click there. And, you know, download the TuneIn app to your phone, TUNE, TuneIn app, because they have like 300 of my podcasts there on TuneIn. Just any of the platforms you get your podcast from, just search for the African History Network show, because we're on 6 different podcast platforms. And if you are an African American business owner and you want to advertise with the African History Network, email us at customerservice@AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, because you put your 30-second or 60-second commercial into our audio podcast, and each episode reaches thousands of people across the country each episode. Okay, and we can record a commercial for you if you don't have one. First month is on sales is 50% off. It's only $100. So we can help you if you're an African American business owner. You can post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast, but we can help you gain new customers. So I asked, and we were short for time when I interviewed Dr. Claude Anderson, but I asked him how many black people registered to vote in the 2016 election. He said he didn't know, but he said he doesn't get involved in things like that. He said our vote didn't matter. That's not true. There was 16.4 million African Americans registered to vote in the 2016 election. How do I know? Pew Research. I do the research. Pew Research Center has it. I saw it first on AM Joy, Joanne Reed, and then I went and pulled up the article from the Pew Research Center. This is easy. All this is easily researchable, easily verifiable. Okay. 16.4 million African Americans were registered to vote in the 2016 election. And I've got it right here because I have thousands of articles printed up. Pew Research, okay? Pew Research Center. Black voter turnout fell in 2016 even as record number of Americans cast ballots. Pull that article up from pewresearch.org, okay? And it has the information there. So only 59% of African Americans registered to vote voted in the 2016 election. That was a 7 percentage point drop from 2012 when 66% voted. that was 66% of African Americans who were registered to vote voting, was the largest percentage in history. There was voter suppression that took place in the 2012 election, but it wasn't as much as 2016. The reason why is because the U.S. Supreme Court case of Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which dealt with the pre-clearance. So immediately after that Supreme Court decision, all these new states start coming out with new voter ID laws. So in 2016, 14 new states had new voter ID laws. There were 868 fewer polling places to vote at in the 2016 election over 2012. TheNation.com had an article about that by Ari Berman, B-E-R-M-A-N, and they have a whole series of articles dealing with the voter suppression in the 2016 election. So what happened was the 7 percentage point drop, right? So Trump won the 3 battleground states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by only 78,000 votes. Trump won. That's the difference between him becoming president and Hillary Clinton becoming president, even though she got 2.8 million more popular votes. Trump won Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by only 78,000 votes. If African Americans had voted at the same level in 2016 that we voted in 2012, just in those 3 states, Trump would not be president right now. See, this is what happens when you don't understand how this works and you don't understand how much power you have. This is why when people say, oh, we're only, and I do a lecture called African American Resistance in the Era of Donald Trump, Voter Suppression, Reparations, and How Elections Have Consequences, and that's available on DVD. But I do a lecture on that, and I go through all this information. And I've had people come up at the end and say, you know, I didn't know this. I thought we were only 13% of the population. How can our vote matter? No, we don't understand how that works. Okay, and the question I ask people is, if you thought your vote didn't matter, why did Republicans work so hard to suppress your vote? If your vote didn't matter, why are Republicans working so hard right now? Even though it's a midterm election, they're working hard right now. You look at Georgia and Brian Kemp, and over the weekend he launches an investigation into the Democratic Party there in Georgia, and says that they tried to hack the Georgia voter database and provided no evidence to substantiate that. They're scared to death down in Georgia that Stacey Abrams, and this is a brilliant sister, graduated from Yale's law school, they're scared to death that this sister is going to become governor. And the votes are there to put this sister in office. Okay? So we don't understand this. Now, the cross-checking system, which was used in 2016, which was created by Chris Kobach, Secretary of State from Kansas, the cross-checking system knocked 1.1 million people off the voter rolls across the country. Okay, it knocked 54,000 people off the voter rolls here in Michigan, and then Jill Stein got 50,000 votes out of Michigan, so that's 104,000 votes just gone. Trump won Michigan by 10,704 votes. Okay, so what we don't understand is that, and I'm trying to find this article here, so give me a minute. What we don't understand is that we had the votes to stop Trump, and we didn't realize it because we didn't understand how many of us were registered to vote, and we keep thinking that because we're 14% of the population that our vote didn't matter. Yes, it did. That's why Republicans feared our vote more than we valued our vote. And it's the same thing today. Republicans feared our vote more than we valued our vote. So we had the votes to stop Trump. In Wayne County, Michigan, Wayne County is the county that Detroit is in. In Wayne County, Hillary Clinton got 70,000 fewer votes than Obama did in 2012. Just in the African American cities, in Detroit, Milwaukee, and probably like Cleveland or something like that. Just the main African American cities. If we voted in 2016 at the same level that we voted in 2012 when Obama was on the ticket, Trump would not be president right now. We do not understand the power that we have. And I'm all for economic empowerment. But when it comes, election day comes, they ain't the time to debate economic empowerment strategy. It's time to take your black ass and go vote. Okay? So I'm all for economic empowerment. I've taught that for years. I've been studying Dr. Claude Anderson since 94. I know Doc. I've interviewed him a number of times. He's one of my teachers. But election day is not the time to debate economic empowerment strategies. That's the time to take your black ass and go vote. I'm serious. Because this election right here is critical. All right? You've got and they put Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court on purpose. Republicans fought tooth and nail to get this crazy boy on the Supreme Court. Okay? Why? For a few reasons. Number one, they knew that you're going to have a Supreme Court case coming up dealing with affirmative action. See, they're trying to reverse any type of progress African Americans made. Affirmative action. You got a case right now, Supreme Court is hearing, dealing with affirmative action at Harvard University and Asian Americans, saying that they're being positions, slots that they should get are going to other ethnic groups like African Americans. They know that you're going to have cases going before the Supreme Court dealing with unions. And Republicans are systematically trying to disempower unions, undercut unions. This is one of the things that the right to work laws do, that are backed by Republicans and backed by the Koch brothers and their nonprofit organization, Americans for Prosperity. Right to work laws. They know that it may go to the Supreme Court dealing with the Affordable Health Care Act and pre-existing conditions. So they maneuvered to get Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, so it'd be 5-4 Republican favor for these rulings. They're playing grandmaster level chess. We're playing beginners checkers that don't even understand all the rules to checkers. And if it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, whether or not a sitting president can be indicted coming from the Mueller investigation, Trump feels that Kavanaugh is going to rule in his favor based upon the previous writings from the legal writings from Kavanaugh, saying that he does not feel that a sitting president can be indicted. So we don't understand this. Okay, we don't. A lot of us don't understand what's taking place, but absolutely we should vote, and we should vote based upon our interests, based upon issues, based upon policies, and how the candidates' issues and how that platform lines up with our issues and our interests, not just as an individual, but also as a people. It's not about political affiliation. It's not about personality. It's about the policies. Okay. Now, on a national level, especially look at the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, it just so happened majority of the time, the Republicans' policies are horrific for African Americans. Now, it may be different at a local level. Usually, mayor, city council, usually those races are nonpartisan. There's usually not the candidates are not usually broken down by political party, okay, for mayor and city council. Okay, it's just, it's nonpartisan. If a Republican wants to run, they can run. It's nonpartisan. It's not broken down by political party. But for state legislature, for governor, it's different. All right. So when we look at Malcolm and what Malcolm was saying, dealing with the, but everybody read that article, Pew Research Center, and see, these are things. So the question you should ask yourself, right, is why aren't other people you listening to telling you this information and giving you these sources? That's the question you should ask yourself, because most of you watching never never heard this document here, Progress of the African American Community during the Obama administration. You never heard anybody break these policies down to you that came from President Obama. And I disagree with President Obama on some things. But I agree with him a whole lot more than this fool that's sitting in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue right now. And I'm looking at the policies that Trump is systematically reversing, dealing with the EPA, okay, and reducing the restrictions on corporations when it comes to dumping and it comes to dealing with the environment, things like that. I'm looking at what he's doing. Okay, so this is from whitehouse.gov, Progress of the African American Community during the Obama administration. You need to read that. PewResearch.org, black voter turnout fell in 2016, even as record number of Americans cast ballots. This breaks it down right here. 7 percentage point drop, that made the difference. African Americans had the power to stop Trump. We did not realize that. Okay, when you look at the election 1960 President of John F. Kennedy versus Richard Nixon, the African American vote made the difference. John F. Kennedy won by less than 2/3 of 1 percentage point. It was the African American vote pushed him over the top, and it made the difference also in the state of Illinois as well, as I talked about last night. Okay. Now, so like I said, we have to understand when we deal with Malcolm, we have to put his speeches in context, right? April 4th, 1964 in Detroit, the Battle of the Bullet. That was before the Civil Rights Act was passed. Now, the most important thing that we have to understand, and one of the most important things we have to understand, is that because of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and because of the Voting Rights Act of 65, those Southern segregationists, those Dixiecrats that Malcolm talked about, they are largely going to leave the Democratic Party. And where do they go? They go to the Republican Party, which is where they are today. This is why the Republicans are the obstructionists. This is why the Republicans are reversing all these policies President Obama had in place. You had a switch in the parties. And then a lot of the constituents are going to switch as well. So if you look at Strom Thurmond, white supremacist U.S. Senator, segregationist Strom Thurmond. In 1948, Strom Thurmond ran for president as a Dixiecrat, okay? And luckily he did not win. But because of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, Strom Thurmond leaves the Democratic Party. He goes to the Republican Party, where he died a Republican. So when people talk about Malcolm and the Democrats in 64 and all this stuff, they don't deal with the history that came after. They don't say, well, wait a second. You had these most of these Southern segregationists, Dixiecrats. They're going to leave the Democratic Party and go to the Republican Party. And there's some differences I have with Democrats, and some Democrats need to be voted out of office. But in general, I agree with their policies because I study policies in general. I agree with their policies a whole lot more than most of the policies coming from the Republican Party. And I'm neither Democrat nor Republican. I just do research. So when you read the Ballad of the Bullet, the one from April 4th, 1964 in Detroit, Malcolm says, I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago while the senators were filibustering. So that was March 26, 1964, when he met Dr. King I was telling you about. And I noticed in the back of the Senate a huge map. And on this map, it showed the distribution of Negroes in America. And surprisingly, the same senators that were involved in the filibuster were from the states where there were the most Negroes. It's basically the Southern Democrats. Why were they filibustering the civil rights legislation? Because the civil rights legislation is supposed to guarantee voting rights to Negroes in those states, and those senators from those states know that if the Negroes in those states can vote, those senators are down the drain. The representatives of those states go down the drain. And in the Constitution of this country, it has a stipulation wherein whenever the rights, the voting rights of people in a certain district are violated, then the representative who's from that particular district, according to the Constitution, is supposed to be expelled from Congress. Now, if this particular aspect of the Constitution was enforced, he said, why you wouldn't have a white man in Washington, D.C. But what would happen when you expel the Dixiecrat? You're expelling the Democrat. When you destroy the power of the Dixiecrat, you're destroying the power of the Democratic Party. Okay, but keep in mind, this is 64. Because of the Civil Rights Act of 64, that's signed into law a few months after this speech, because of the Voting Rights Act of August 6, 1965, signed into law by Johnson, because of affirmative action, Executive 11246, Executive Order 11246, September 24th, 1965. These Southern Dixiecrat obstructionist, segregationist Democrats, they're largely going to leave the Democratic Party and they go to the Republican Party. This is why the Republican Party is doing what they're doing today. Okay? So, read this once again. digitalhistory.uh.edu. That's the ballot or the bullet from August 4th, 1964. Now, Malcolm talked about the Constitution, and he talked about it has a stipulation wherever the rights, the voting rights of people in a certain district are violated, then the representative who's from that particular district, according to the Constitution, is supposed to be expelled from Congress. That's the 14th Amendment. That's a section of the 14th Amendment. Okay, and what it is, now Dr. Claude Anderson talked about this last Sunday when I interviewed him, October 28th. So go back and listen to this. And I carry a copy of the Constitution with me. And I read it and he explained it, so you can go back and listen to it. But what he's saying is, I talked about voter suppression. And voter suppression is real, it's taking place. But what he's saying is, when the voter suppression takes place like that, it's section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Yeah. He's saying that based upon the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, then you can, you probably have to take them to court. I haven't seen this done, but it's part of the Constitution, so we need to research this. The person who wins because of the voter suppression, you can have them expelled from Congress. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment says representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment corrects Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution, known as the 3/5 Compromise of 1787. Now, the 3/5 Compromise, contrary to popular belief, did not say that we were 3/5 of a human being. They're talking about for the purpose of taxation and apportionment, and how do you determine how many seats in the U.S. House of Representatives slave-holding states will have. So they're saying count 3/5 of the enslaved Africans in a particular state. Count 3/5 of the population. It does not say, and when you study the history behind this, it does not say we were 3/5 of a human being. That's a total misunderstanding, misinterpretation. Part of that comes from Malcolm X's interview in Berkeley, California, University of California, Berkeley, I think it was 1963, where he talks about the Constitution in that interview, and he says that it said we were 3/5 of a human being. That's historically inaccurate. It does not say that. But even if it did, it was corrected 150 years ago by Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. So nobody says that. Nobody says, wait a second, the 3/5 Compromise was corrected 150 years ago by Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. But when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for president and vice president of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of a state, like governor, or the members of the legislature thereof, is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state between being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way abridged, except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state. So that deals with voter suppression, and that deals with a legal remedy based upon Section 2 of the Constitution for voter suppression. Now, I don't know how often that's been used. I know lawsuits take place, but I don't know how often that's been used, specifically that. But we need to investigate that. All right, so African American business owners, hey, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. Email us at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. Customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network on the audio podcast of our various broadcasts like this one here, because this will be on 6 different podcast platforms today or tomorrow. And we reach thousands of people across the country with each episode. On Blog Talk, we get between about 4,000 to 8,000 listens per episode. And we're on Blog Talk, Castbox, iTunes. We're on a number of different podcast platforms, okay? And first month is 50% off. All right, so let's see here. And then also you can donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN show. That helps us keep doing the research, stay on the air, keep broadcasting our radio show Sunday nights, pay the bills, etc. Now, also there was a article from Washington Post, WashingtonPost.com, and I was trying to find an article. I can't find it. It's somewhere around here. But that article is really good because it talks about how, and you can Google this, it talks about how in 2016, there were 4 million people who voted for, there were 4 million Obama voters in 2016 who did not vote, who voted in 2012 for president, okay? So in 2016, 4 million people who voted for President Obama in 2012 did not vote for president. And 1/3 of them were African American. Once again, Trump won the 3 battleground states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. That gave him the needed 270 electoral college votes. That made the difference. He won those 3 states by only 78,000 votes. You could have gotten that out of Detroit. Okay? Now you had to get him out of those. He had to win those 3 states, the electoral college, but you could have gotten 78,000 votes just out of Detroit. Okay? But once again, people did not know, and they were listening to the wrong people. And the question you should ask people who told you don't vote during the 2016 election cycle, you should ask them, who was paying you to tell us not to vote? That's a legitimate question. Who was paying you to tell us not to vote? All right, so look, guys, hey, I got to get out of here. Remember, Election Day, November 6th, vote your interest, be an educated voter, vote the issues that pertain to our people, pertain to you, specific to your city, etc. It's not about party affiliation. It's about policies, okay? And let's see here. Let's see if there's anything else. And also at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, you know, we have the 8 DVD bundle pack, The Africans Who Were Here Before Columbus. The Africans Who Were Here Before Columbus. It includes a double lecture I did with Dr. David Imhotep, who wrote the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. Includes the lecture from Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, They Came Before Columbus, and some other things. Is a presentation, it's a lecture from Dr. John Henry Clark and Dr. Yosef Ben Yakin. It's an 8 DVD bundle pack, okay? AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. All right, so look, hey, we have to get out of here. Hey, remember, at the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world. Because right now it's correct wrong behavior. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, and what you allow other people to do to you is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you have been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. Right now it's correct wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. We'll talk to you next time. Peace.